Now that we've reached 1 o'clock, I think we'll get started. We'll start first with a little bit of housekeeping. As I just said, this webinar is recorded, but also want to make sure that you're aware of some of the functionality of GoToMeeting. So this is being recorded and the slides are available right now for you to download under the handouts pane. One thing that we'd really ask you to do if you're looking at that control panel, please also, I just realized my webinar's not on. We also ask you to please use the ask a question function. So you'll see another list, which is questions. Please use that instead of the chat, because we might not be able to monitor the chat as successfully, but we will get those questions directly. So if you have questions, please use ask a question. We realize we might have a lot of questions that we are not able to get to today, but please know that we'll get a report of all of your questions and we will use those to develop the FAQs that we'll be uploading to our website. And that's just a note to let you know that we are planning to update our website with additional resources beyond what is available there now. If you go to the PSC website and search LSLs, you'll get to the page that we'll be updating. Unfortunately, right now, we're on an agency-wide hold while there's a big upgrade going. So check back for those resources. But again, most important thing, just check the handout tab of the control panel for GoToMeeting to see the handouts. So the agenda here, just make sure you're all in the right meeting. We are going to be talking about lead service line replacement on the private side. Here's the breakdown of the sections we're going to cover. We're going to do an introduction of who we are and what we plan to talk about. We're going to do a brief history of PSC decisions. We're going to talk very in detail about using customer rates for private side LSL removal, how to approach your accounting treatment within utilities for that work. We're going to go through some of the FAQs that we've received already. And then if we have time, we'll provide an overview of utility financial assistance programs. So those are financial assistance programs approved through the PSC. And then we'll do a little wrap up. So with that, I am going to launch, we'll go to the next slide, and we're hoping to learn a little bit more about us. So this will just give us an idea of what our participants are. So there's a poll up there right now. Just give us an idea of what your backgrounds are, where you're working. Give it a minute. Okay. All right, looks like it's slowed down. I'm going to close that. And then I'm going to share the results so people can see. Looks like we're pretty evenly split between utility and municipal attendees and another set of others. So be curious to see afterwards who attended that qualified as other. I know state employees probably fit into that. And we have some of our partners from DNR and DOA are also coming. All right, so we'll do another poll. What is your experience with utility rate making before the PSC? I think it's fun because some of my PSC colleagues can't see what I can see. So this will be a big reveal for them. We're at about 80% voted. Keep voting, please. All right. All right, we're just, looks like those who are going to vote have voted. All right, sharing this. Some experienced, very experienced, no experience. So looks like most of our folks have had some interaction with the PSC. Only 15% are very experienced. So 35% no experience, 50% some experience. Thanks for that. And then the last one is this one. just as we begin to launch, this one should show up. Have you guys, can you see the poll? Yeah, great.
Here it goes.
There you go. This one is just so we have an idea as we go through where your interest lies. We do hope to cover all of these things, but knowing what folks are most interested in will help us prioritize our discussion. All right, we're at about 50% have voted. Okay, about 75%. Please keep voting. Thank you. Okay, just a few more. All right, seems to have slowed down. I'm going to close that and share that one. Okay, so hopefully you can see this. It looks like most interested how rates can finance private side LSL not covered by Safe Drinking Water Loan Program. Behind that, it's about an even split between approvals required to finance LSL using Safe Drinking Water Loan Program, how to create a utility assistance program, and then the accounting treatment for cash on hand. So for my colleagues, it's about 33% have chosen option 2. Okay, great. All right, so now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Andy.
Your mic, right?
Mm-hmm. And turn on your webcam.
Got it. Okay, very good. Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be with you. My name is Andy Galvin. I'm the Division Administrator for the Division of Water Utility Regulation and Analysis here at the PSC. I really thank all of you for coming. We're at about 150 different participants today, so clearly there's need for this seminar, and I'm glad everybody is with us. As many of you know, for many years, the use of customer rates to remove lead service lines on the private side was prohibited by the PSC. What some looked at as a fairly straightforward solution to the problem of getting the lead out, in other words, using customer rates to do this, has been anything but straightforward. Unfortunately, it has, with one exception, not been something we've been able to do. But there have been some solutions out there. I just thought it'd be useful to go through a few of these real quick. As many of you know, there have been significant federal dollars that have come to the state. Many of you have taken advantage of Safe Drinking Water Loan Program principal forgiveness funds, and even more recently, loans from Safe Drinking Water. In 2018, the state legislature allowed the use of utility revenues for customer side LSL removal, albeit in a very limited and prescriptive manner. And of course, there's always the possibility of requiring the customers themselves to pay for their individual lead service line replacements, although I realize many utilities are doing everything they can in their powers to avoid that, which is commendable. However, each of these funding sources have their pros and cons, and none of them, unfortunately, are silver bullets to solve the problem. In fact, it probably would be safe to say that there's still plenty of unanswered questions that are out there. And so I just want to say that we appreciate the challenges that all of you face in this endeavor to get the lead out. And I hope that today will provide some needed clarity, specifically as it relates to the PSC's role in evaluating the proper use of customer rates for the removal of private side lead service lines. Because that's really the purpose of today's seminar. As the effort to remove lead advances, these complexities have evolved. And we're aware that there are lots of questions about the need for PSC approval or the proper use of customer funds, especially as it relates to the use of Safe Drinking Water funding and the interplay between those two. So our primary goal today is to address these questions head on, as directly as we can. So we think we've got a pretty good handle on these questions. our presentation is oriented to not only providing these direct answers, but also in explaining the why behind those answers. So we've had conversations with the DNR, the DOA, thanks to both of them for their part in this, related to this interplay between Safe Drinking Water Loan Program funding and customer rates. We've talked to utilities across the state to try to understand their questions and their issues. But I just want to say that if there are questions that remain unanswered, if we're not hitting the mark for you in this venue here today, I invite you to make sure that you ask a question, either bring it up in the question section that Angela already talked about, or make sure you bring it up with us later at the end. But we are really trying to understand. We want to make sure that we can answer the questions you have as best we can. Okay. Yes, you right there, that'd be great.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, very good. You're all probably familiar with our team. This is our full staff for our division. This is the team that does all rate cases, construction cases, tariff changes, and all the things that we do here at the PSC related to water utilities. There are 3 of us that are going to be presenting today. So I'll be presenting a fair share. Angela James, who started us off this morning, will be coming in and out along with me to present various things. And then in addition to that, our principal auditor, Kathy Busloff, will be jumping in, especially with some of the more detailed auditing and accounting information. So I just want to thank both of them. Angela has been in this position for 2 months and has dove into the issue of lead service line replacement head first, and really learned a lot in the last couple of months and helped us further this along. So it's much appreciated, all of her efforts. And I think a lot of you know Kathy as our principal auditor, and she too, I want to thank her in advance for all of the accounting expertise that she brings to this conversation. Okay. Okay, so I want to set the table here a little bit with just some important notes. I'm going to have a few of the slides of this kind of stuff that I think is important as we do dive into this question about the interplay of customer rates and removing private side lead service lines. There's some important things to mention. So first off, the PSC is a quasi-judicial agency. And this means that the PSC functions in a way that's similar to a court, although it's not a court. The PSC is made up of 3 commissioners. And the 3 commissioners are the decision makers in all of the activity of our agency. And they make that decision, or all those decisions, in a legal manner similar to a court. Primarily, they're applying the state statutes that we have in front of us to the particular applications at hand. Every case that comes before the commission is organized as a docket, and the work that we do for the most part is limited to those dockets. And the decisions that are made by the commissioners are based on the record that's developed in those dockets. If you're familiar with both the DNR and the PSC, you probably can easily see that there are some fundamental differences in the process and procedures of both agencies. And those differences are important as we talk about this particular topic. The commission reviews every case on its own merit. No case sets precedent, and thus you may see different opinions over time from commissioners as knowledge and issues evolve. Generally, the commission looks to past cases to consider how it makes a decision in the future, but each case is based on specific facts and circumstances presented in that particular record. Unique to the water side of the PSC, most of the decisions have been delegated to my position as a division administrator, primarily because there are just so many water utilities in the state, 575 or so. And most of the cases that we get from those utilities are fairly routine and repeated decisions. But it is noteworthy to say that anything that's unique or novel or disputed, those kinds of dockets would go to the full commission. So a note for today, we'll not be talking about any active dockets that we have before us, primarily because I'm the decision maker and I can't do that. And we're also going to limit the discussion of specific cases as much as we can. We certainly can talk about things in the past, but in looking forward, we have to be careful not to talk about cases that might be coming before us in the near future. What we can't do today is anticipate how the commission will decide a case in the future. We are not the decision makers, the commission is, and so the information that we provide today is meant to be an overview, especially of past commission decisions, and it's not considered legal advice. Always a good idea to consult your attorney, especially an attorney that has some experience with commission proceedings. So this area of private side lead service line removal is an area that's constantly developing, it's constantly evolving. We've seen a lot of that in the last 8 years or so. Hopefully one day these issues will all be behind us, but for now we're all trying to work on this together and figure out how this evolves in front of us. Okay, a couple of notes about terminology. I'm going to guess most of you are very familiar with this, but I put it up here just to set the stage. Everything, you can see the dashed red line that goes along the sidewalk in this graphic. Everything on the right we consider, or the industry considers, to be utility-owned infrastructure. That would be the water main, that would be a portion of the service line that extends towards the house up into the curb stop. All of that to the right would be utility infrastructure, utility side lead service lines. Everything to the left of that red line is what is considered the private side lead service line, the customer side lead service line. That's the portion that we're talking about today. That's the portion that the customer really has the financial responsibility in most cases to replace, to maintain, and all of that. Another note would just be that we do include in our understanding of lead service lines, and this has become universal, but just a note, we do include galvanized in our definition of lead service lines, or LSLs. Okay. Okay, the next, regulated customer revenues. So I want to provide a little bit of okay, somehow I just got that's me. Sorry about that. Okay, let me talk a little bit about customer rates. We throw a lot of terms around, and the more we have talked about this internally, the more we realize that there's probably some confusion about a lot of these different terms. We've spent a lot of time trying to really understand this, figure it out so that we can explain it to you, especially since a lot of utilities are trying to be very creative with how they can assist in replacing these lead service lines on the private side. Commendable, but it does increase the complexities for sure. So let me start off with a little bit of background. If you think back to your high school, history classes about the 1800s and the early 1900s, you no doubt talked about monopolies. Many of you are certainly familiar with the concept. But if you think back to like an electric company in the early 1900s, that electric company is considered a monopoly because it's the only one who provides service to a particular service area. What comes along with being a monopoly is the risk, right, of not treating customers fairly. And there's certainly been plenty of examples of that through history, where rates might have, customers might have been gouged by rates, or rates might have been applied differently to different customers. So the concept of utility regulation to some degree stems from that reality. All of your water utilities are natural monopolies. The reason you're regulated by the PSC is because the PSC has a regulatory role that acknowledges that you're a monopoly, but provides protections for the customer to make sure that their rates and their service is fair, it's reasonable, and it's non-discriminatory. And so that concept really is the primary thing that affects the Commission's understanding of funding private side lead service lines with customer rates. So consider it this way. If a utility were to provide funding, customer rates for private side funding, for private side replacement, it would be treating one customer in a different manner from all of those customers that don't have lead service lines. It would be using rates from everybody to subsidize a benefit for just a few. And that's fundamentally the issue. Angela's going to talk in a little bit about the Madison case that occurred at the late 1998 that really set this up and the reality of where we are today. And one of the phrases I want to just say real quick, because I think it's illustrative. The commission stated that it found that it was unreasonable and unjustly discriminatory if public program dollars generated through utility rates were to be authorized as a subsidy to furnish a direct benefit to an exclusive group of private property owners. So this idea of utility rates, right? That's at the issue. So you'll see on the slide, I have customer rates, utility rates, customer money, a lot of these other things that we have called these rates. As we dive into this more, it really becomes apparent to us that while it includes customer rates, it's slightly broader than that. It's really regulated customer revenues. And what that means is anything that you include in the development of your rates during a rate case, essentially what's in your revenue requirement is what is considered in developing your rates. Those are all used to pay for utility operations. That revenue requirement, what those particular things are all listed and described in your PSC annual report in Schedule W1 and the supporting schedules that come after that. So you can see all of that. We're going to talk about that specifically in a lot more detail as we get to later slides, but I just wanted to at least introduce that concept. Okay. And then in addition to that, you do have access to other rates. Let me give you a hypothetical. Let's say Bill Gates calls you up tomorrow and he says, hey, I want to offer you $100 million to replace every lead service line on the private side in your utility. That would be a very welcome pot of gold many of you would appreciate, I'm sure. That money that would come in from Bill Gates is not something that the PSC would have concerns about. That would not fall under these prohibitions that we're talking about for these regulated customer revenues. You can find those kinds of dollars also on your PSC annual report in Schedule F1. And again, we'll talk more about this in a little bit later. Those dollars do not go into your revenue requirement. They are not factored in as the PSC develops your customer rates. They're completely separate. Safe Drinking Water Loan Program funding would be treated in very much the same way. They do not fall under what we consider to be these regulated customer revenues. Some utilities are now beginning to look for those other revenue streams as perhaps sources of funding that they might be able to use for various things. We acknowledge that. We want to kind of address that here today for sure, but there are cautions about doing that. And so we'll be talking more about what some of those cautions are as we move through the presentation. Okay, so what are we going to talk about today? We're definitely going to be talking about private side lead service lines, not utility side. We're definitely going to be talking about when customer revenues, regulated customer revenues can be used and when it's not appropriate to use them. We really are going to try to answer those two questions first off on the right. What can customer rates pay for, and when is PSC approval needed for any kind of utility involvement? I'm going to stop there. I think that kind of covers my introductory remarks to set the stage. I'm going to hand it over now to Angela again, and she's going to go through kind of a historic overview of how we've gotten to where we are today.
All right, thanks, Andy. I'm going to go through this relatively quickly just because Andy covered a lot of the fundamentals, but we created this roadmap to try to illustrate where things have been over kind of the life of lead service line removals, and broke it up into these 4 different eras to help explain how the PSC has reacted to questions about financing this private side LSL removal. And like Andy said, it's been challenging. So we're going to start with the first era, which Andy talked about briefly in his remarks, which is the 1998 decision in the Madison case. So Andy read this quote to you already. I think the most important thing to just remember here is the Madison case really established that it was unreasonable to use this regulated customer revenue to pay for something that was the responsibility of a private homeowner. So that set the stage for the challenges that we're paying right now related to paying for these things. Okay, next. So then our next era was 2018, where we had an important, development at the Wisconsin legislature. So recognizing the importance of lead service line removal, the state legislature passed an act to create statute number 196-372. And that specifically addressed private side lead service line removals. Now, what's really important to remember here is this is a very narrow exception to that general provision that utility regulated customer revenue cannot be used to remove private side infrastructure. So what this did was say that if customers wanted to remove these LSLs, and if a bunch of statutory requirements were met, you could take that regulated customer revenue and create a utility financial assistance program, which we will probably slip into calling FAPs, because everybody in government loves an acronym. So utility financial assistance programs are within the utility using that regulated customer revenue to create grants and loans to provide direct financial assistance to private owners for removing their private LSLs. So that is limited to financial assistance. So our next era is the era that we're kind of still in and coming out of, and that is the 2021-2022 federal money in response to COVID. So that federal COVID relief money created a once-in-a-generation opportunity to try to address this and have funding. The bipartisan infrastructure law, which has been called a whole lot of other things, provided money directly through state revolving loan funds here in Wisconsin. That's the Safe Drinking Water Loan Program, which we abbreviate here as SDWLP, to get money out to communities looking to remove lead service lines. And that was on both the utility side and the private side. So when that money started coming through, the commission looked at it, and given the information Andy provided you, we decided that this is not, regulated customer revenue. Therefore, activity that you were undertaking as part of implementation of a safe drinking water loan program, private side, was not our concern because, again, regulated customer revenue was not involved. That was when most of that money coming through was in the form of a grant or principal forgiveness, PF dollars. So because regulated customer revenue wasn't involved in this time period, we weren't doing any approvals of the use of that money. But we were telling utilities that they had sort of ancillary costs associated with administering that they should account for that in below the line accounting, which we will discuss in the accounting treatment. But that was outside of utilities' regulated customer revenue. Fine. And then we got to 2024, which was the era of that we're in now as well, which is when the city of Sheboygan had an existing financial assistance program. So they had already received approval from the commission to create one of those internal to the utility grants and loans program using regulated customer revenue. They wanted to expand that program to not only create financial assistance for customers, so not just to give grants and loans, but also to pay for additional costs associated with their overall administration of safe drinking water loan funds that were coming to them. And they asked specifically to pay staff to administer the safe drinking water loan program dollars, and then also to pay the interest on those loans using that regulated customer revenue. And in 2024, the commission said no. Under the law, 196-372, all that you can do in a utility financial assistance program approved by the PSC is give financial assistance in the form of grants and loans. So we go to, just to wrap up this history, generally, if you're using regulated customer revenue, that cannot be used on the private side. The exception to that, and the only exception to that, is a utility financial assistance program, a FAP, under section 196-372 stats. And so Madison told us rates can't be used for that private side benefit because that's discriminatory, as Andy discussed. And then if you do a financial assistance program, which is allowed, you can use customer rates for that. The limit there is that that money can only go out to the private customers through grants and loans or financial assistance. The rest of those dollars can't be used for other costs under a financial assistance program. Okay. So you're probably saying, great, what can we pay for and when do we need approval for other uses of customer revenue? Well, it's very limited and we're going to go into some more detail on that, and I'll turn it over to Andy for that.
All right, thank you, Angela. Hey, we should maybe just do a couple of things from the questions, just so people know. I don't know if everybody's following the questions, but folks cannot use the chat. So if you have something to ask, please use the questions that is over on the right-hand side of your dashboard. And we've got a couple questions just to clarify some abbreviations. As Angela said, SDWLP is Safe Drinking Water Loan Program. PF,
I think they can all see those answers.
Okay. And then the other one we have in there is the FAP, the FAP, just to be clear, Financial Assistance Program approved through the commission. Okay, very good. Next slide. So just to follow up with what Angela said, the two questions we get the most are these two. I think we've answered these. What can customer rates pay for? Well, they can't be used to fund private side removal or any related costs unless that only exception is the commission approved utility financial assistance program, or the FAP. That would be the time in which commission approval is needed. There really is no other situation in which any kind of PSC approval would be needed for any kind of private side or even utility side, private side lead service line removal. But this leads us to a couple other questions, which I call bonus questions. So these two things, are there other utility revenue sources? And I would say that as we enter this territory, we enter it with trepidation, because some utilities may have some, most utilities probably won't. And even those utilities that may have some additional revenue sources, it's probably very likely they're going to be very limited. There are also some cautions that come with this discussion in the form of how does this get accounted and how is it going to be handled in your future rate case in terms of whether you get recovery and all those kinds of things. And lastly, there's also a little bit of a concern about what this could do to your utility if these kinds of funds are used in a way that might not be proper. So that's the perhaps on that particular thing. There may be some other revenue streams. Again, typically they're going to be limited. How to account for these expenses? There are definitely specific requirements on how do we account for them, and we got to be really clear on what that is, and so we're going to get into that in some particular detail. Okay, so to explain this and again set the stage a little bit for Kathy to talk about the accounting side of this, it's good to consider this from the perspective of how utilities develop their rates and how things are, where they're put in terms of the accounting perspective. Okay, next slide. Okay, there we go.
Sorry, flagging.
Man, just takes over. Okay, so first off, real quick summary. What are we talking about when we say approval? From the PSC perspective of what's required for approval from the commission, there's a couple of instances. The first would be if a utility did want to apply for a utility financial assistance program to use customer rates for private side lead service line removal, obviously they would have to get that approved. That would occur in an LS docket. And those approvals occur before any dollars are actually added to your customer rates. So you may get approval and you can start using customer funds, but you don't actually have any additional rates. That comes in your next rate case. And in that next rate case, that would be handled as a WR docket. That's where we would again develop a revenue requirement. We would look at all of your operating and maintenance expenses and other things for a test year, and then we would develop rates based on that. Okay. So I think this is an important concept that I want to make sure everybody understands. So consider these three scenarios. These are progressive. The first on your left was your current rates, and they were set in your last rate case, the last time you had a WR docket. At that time, your revenue requirement was developed, and the revenues and expenses that were developed, that were used to develop your revenue requirement, can be found in Schedule W1 in your PSC annual report. They change each year, of course, but during the time in which your revenue requirement was developed in your last rate case, they were accurate. Those costs, typically, if you're coming to us today for a utility-owned financial assistance program, for a utility FAP, those current rates would not include any LS costs. So then, let's say today you come and you ask for a LS docket to get an approved utility FAP. In that case, you would get approval, assuming you got approval, but the rates wouldn't change. So your bucket, your dollars at the bottom are still exactly the same as they were at the time of your last rate case. It isn't going to be until your next rate case, our third column here, where the revenue requirement is again going to be reviewed. Any cost that you anticipate for the forward-looking test year. So let's say today you have a year 26 test year. It would be what you plan to spend as part of your lead service line private side removal program that would be put into your revenue requirement. The bucket then of your rates would be bigger because now those costs are included. So just going back to the LS docket in the middle, it doesn't mean you can't spend any funds once you have that approved FAP. It just means that you don't have any additional funds. There's nothing new that was added to it at that point. Okay. So the next slide here is going to talk a little bit more about this rate making process. And I think a lot of you are familiar with it, but I'm just going to go through it for those of you who might not be as familiar. This is a very simplified explanation of it. There's plenty of more detail than this, but I think it'll get to the point we're trying to make in terms of the delineation of costs that are or are not part of your regulated customer revenues. So in the green graphic there, you'll see at the top the revenue requirement. When our staff look at your books to determine rates, the first thing they do is they look at what's going to be in the revenue requirement. It's just a dollar number. And if you look over to the right, you can see the four things that make up the revenue requirement. Your operating and maintenance expenses, your taxes or your pilot, depreciation cost on all of your infrastructure, and then a rate of return. Those four things are what we look at, again, for a particular test year. So whatever those costs are going to be in that test year is what your rates are going to be set on, and then you'll have until your next rate case. After the revenue requirement is set, you have that one number. It's then consider it kind of a pie. The cost allocation allocates it to all the different customers. You split up the pie, and then you develop the rates based on that. So that's generally what it is. But the point that I want to just make sure everybody understands is the revenue requirement and the costs that go into that. So what's not in the revenue requirement? Well, often when we do rate cases, there are things that are not in the revenue requirement or things that people have spent or want to spend money on that may not be appropriate for customer rates. So for example, lobbying costs are typically excluded from the revenue requirement because that's not a cost that's appropriate for the use of customer rates. advertising costs. Some of you have perhaps tried to come up with things like water bottles that have not been able to be included in the revenue requirement. Sometimes utilities have billing services for a different utility. That would be a revenue stream, but it wouldn't be considered customer rates or something that would be in the revenue requirement itself. So these items, and again, Kathy will go into this in more detail, but those items do not have the same restrictions as our regulated customer revenues. And there is some possibility that they could be used for non-utility efforts to remove customer side or private side lead service lines. Again, there's some cautions there, which we're going to talk about, but that is a possible revenue stream that utilities could consider. And then just lastly, those costs are found on your PSC annual report in Schedule F1. So with that, I'm going to pass it now over to Kathy, and she's going to dive into some of the details.
Thanks, Andy. Exciting to talk about accounting, I hope. But it is important, even if it's not, the most exciting topic in the world. So I want to dive in a little bit deeper to some of what Andy said here, talk about the accounting. So the revenue requirement, Andy just went over the 4 types of costs that go into the revenue requirement. You talked about setting it in a conventional rate case where commission staff reviews all these costs. The commission determines these costs. And again, it's based on reasonable operating and capital costs to operate your utility. We use a forward-looking test year. So, soon utilities will be filing conventional rate case applications for a 2026 test year. I like to say the shortcut to see what goes into these revenue requirements and the customer revenue from this regulated arena that you collect are all on page W1 of the annual reports. Sometimes we kind of call this above the line. It's the regulated arena. And when you move forward and look at some of the other pages, you'll get to some more detail. So page W2 is one example. Here's the summary. You have your revenues and your expenses. Page W2 talks about mostly your general service rates and fire protection. Page W3 is sales for resale if you have wholesale customers. And page W4 would be some other types of regulated customer revenue that we also consider part of your revenue requirement and needed to support needs of the water utility. You'll see late payment charges. Towards the bottom, there's other water revenues that have tariffs such as R-1 for reconnection or AM-1 for additional meter charges and some other miscellaneous things. In the middle of your page, you'll see rents from water property. The most common would be a water utility that has water towers and has leases from cell phone companies to put antennas on that. We do get questions about this. So the water tower is a water utility asset. It's included in the plant and service schedules. The water utility customers support the expenses and capital costs for that water tower. Therefore, both the costs related to the water tower and any revenues related to the water tower are included in the regulated arena and used for utility purposes. So what about some of these non-utility revenues that Andy talked about? He talked about utilities occasionally doing some other types of activity, perhaps offering billing services for some smaller utilities nearby, offering a certified operator, maybe having a contract with a smaller water utility nearby to provide their certified operator for the year, get paid to do that. Those are types of things that would be in the W pages. There's a summary on page W1, and you'd see some of this detail on page, on this book, on page F1. And you'd see the summary on page F3. We do have some screenshots of that. I'm not sure that they're showing up right now. But like I said, there we go. Kind of call that below the line. It's below what happens in the regulated arena. Typically, when I looked up a few of these examples, utilities are not making a lot of money doing this. They're more so trying to break even if they're offering billing services or a certified operator to help a neighboring community. It's fine to make a little money on this, you know, you don't want to lose money, but this is pretty typical of what you might see for some of these utilities. There's a few other things that you might see just as like a one-line item on page F1 that I'll mention before we move forward. A couple times I've seen a utility that needed to drill a new well on the edge of town, and they were only able to buy an 80-acre parcel, but they said we only need 2 acres to drill our well and put in the pump house. So they took 2 acres, recorded it as utility plant service, and recovered those costs from their customers. The rest of the land, they recorded as non-utility property, and they were actually able to rent it to a farmer and collect some money each year. So that would have appeared on W1. On F1, I should write it on the board, on F1, outside of the regulated arena. One other example of something might show up on F1 is I've seen sometimes the charitable donations. Sometimes a utility might help out their city or village with a Christmas parade, putting up Christmas decorations, something like that. As long as it's, you know, small activities like that, it's not something that we review and comment on. So moving to the next slide then, which you've seen already. What do you do for accounting treatment when you're replacing private side LSLs using the Safe Drinking Water program funds? Well, first of all, the important thing to keep in mind is this is not a utility financial assistance program. It's considered something that is funds provided to the municipality. So the easiest way to keep this nice and clean is option number 1. All activity related to this Safe Drinking Water Loan Program funding is on the municipal books, and the municipality handles everything. We know that can be a challenge due to staffing limits and other things like that. So the utility gets involved sometimes, perhaps even because it's felt that the utility staff have more expertise. So what should be done for accounting treatment if utility staff becomes involved? First of all, the large amounts of money coming from the Safe Drinking Water Loan Program, whether it's loans or principal forgiveness, and money handed on to the customer should all remain on the municipal books. But when you come to administrative costs, this is something that would be below the line. You need to record it on page F3 as non-utility activity. You probably won't really have any revenue to reflect, but in account 416, you will record the expenses of your staff members at your utility. If they spend 15% of their time during the week, 15% of their salary and benefits and supplies would all need to be non-utility activity on page F3. Move along to the next slide then. So this is different than that limited exception that Angela explained under the statutes. The utility financial assistance program, where we only have a dozen or so utilities right now with those authorized programs. You could be giving out a combination of loans and grants to customers to replace their customer side service line. Loans will go on your balance sheet as basically a liability from the customers that you'll be collecting. Grants, since you're spending that money handing out that grant, go on your operating income statement in account 664, and your costs to administer those grants and loans would also go on account 664. So again, just to emphasize, this is for a utility financial assistance program that's been approved by the commission. Getting towards the end of what I wanted to say, and maybe taking just a little bit different view, sometimes we have utilities say, well, what about cash? So I've been talking mostly about income statement activity, revenues and expenses that happen on an ongoing basis. Cash is something you have in the bank at a period in time. So the utility looks at the checking account, maybe looks at some CDs, wherever you have your cash saved, and say, can we use some of this cash? Well, yes. Utilities have discretion to use the cash however they want within reason. So the commission will be reviewing this both in conventional rate cases and some of our annual report monitoring we do every year to make sure you're not harming the utility. And I think I have a little bit more detail on the next slide about that, about what really does within reason mean. So you can use some of these cash on hand to maybe pay some of these administrative costs for your municipal program. But if you use too much, it could create challenges in the future. So you definitely need to keep an eye on your financial health, how many days cash you have on, that you're not drawing down your cash too much. You need to make sure that you're really using most of the cash you have for utility purposes, replacing water mains, buying that utility truck, replacing meters. You don't want to be delaying that or delaying fixing a pump because you're running out of money. So it's important that you're not taking too much out of the utility to pay for something that is outside of the regulated arena. Every utility is different, but maybe one example I could say is when I talked about kind of charitable contributions towards the community for a Christmas parade or Christmas decorations. If you're a small water utility and they ask for $500 or $1,000 to help with it this year, that's probably fine. You probably have plenty of money in your checking account to help with that. But if next year they say we're having an anniversary celebration and they would like you to pay for most of the parade and give them $50,000 or $100,000 for some, entertainment and everything after the parade, that might harm your utility. That's not your primary purpose. It's to provide water to your customers. So again, yes, you can use your cash, but you've got to keep that reasonableness factor in mind. And I think that's about where I was going to wrap up. I don't know if we're going to try and take a very short break in it.
It's up to you.
Yeah, 5 minutes.
Okay.
Do you want to announce it?
Sure. We're going to take 5 minutes if people need a quick bio break. And then also that'll give you a chance if you have some questions. We're going to the FAQ section. So this would be a good time if you want to ask some of those questions and prep for our FAQ section. This would be a good time to throw those into the question function. You should see a timer. That'll give you an idea when we're coming back. 5 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. We're gonna kind of jump into things here. Hopefully it was just a little bit of a break to help you through our time here together. I just want to point out that for sure, please be looking at the questions section to the right of your dashboard. Lots of really good questions are coming in, and we're trying to answer them directly in the questions section. So please make sure you're looking at that. Also, there are some things that we're adding to the chat. Even though you can't communicate to us with chat, we are putting things in there, definitions and things like that we think might be useful. So please make sure you're looking at both of those. If for some reason this isn't working for you, let us know, because this is our first go around at this. So we'll be happy to modify or do something differently as we need to. The one question that I do want to point out that is blank with an answer, and that's one from Denise Schmidt. It's a very good question, and I think it's one that warrants some consideration. The question is, given that federal rules now require most utilities to replace all LSLs in 10 years, is there any momentum to revise state statutes to remove the PSC approval step? This change would help streamline and facilitate faster, more efficient LSL replacement and free up local and state agency resources. I acknowledge this may be a question for somebody outside the PSC. It's a good question because certainly that is an avenue, right? The legislature certainly could change its current law. It could create new ones to modify the way customer rates are used and the way that utilities can remove these private side load service lines. There are different, at least one, there are some efforts underway, I think, in that regard, but that's really not the role of the PSC. I would suggest people reach out to their lobbyists, their lobbying groups to see what things could be developed. We'd certainly be happy to help in any way there if you need assistance from us. But I think the more utilities can talk to their legislators and talk about some of the difficulties and challenges that they're having with replacing private side lead service lines would be really great. So that's a very good question. I appreciate you for asking that, Denise. Any other questions we want to talk about before
One
we
that
jump
just
in?
came in is probably an easy one to do.
Very last one. Okay, last one. If a municipality receives safe drinking water loan program principal forgiveness money for private side replacement, do those customers still qualify for a utility FAP? Great question. We're going to address that a little bit later. The short answer is absolutely. So you can combine funding. There's no prohibition to doing just one or the other. You can certainly do both safe drinking water, either principal forgiveness for loans, and you can also, if you have a commission approved FAP, you can also use funding for that as well. And I think that is the trend we're seeing with a lot of utilities right now.
All right, I think that's one.
Okay, so with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Angela to get us started with some of what we consider to be the most frequently asked questions, the most questions. And then after that, I'll jump back in and help with a few of those as well.
Yep. Are you muted? Nope. Okay. It's because her volume's coming from there. Why don't you just unmute?
I'm
Okay, you're not muted. Okay, I thought, okay. Sorry about that. Again, we've had some technical issues. The slide before you can see that we're acknowledging many questions that communities are facing right now have to do with the intersection of PSC approvals and safe drinking water loan program. And we just want to acknowledge and really make it clear, we do not get into the administration of safe drinking water loan program. That is a DNR program. And what we look at really deals exclusively when you need to change your revenue because of something that's brought on by your intersection with the safe drinking water loan program. So we've gotten a number of questions about the safe drinking water loan program itself, and we'll refer you to DNR for those. So next question. These are really just our interpretation of the most frequent questions that we receive about interaction with the safe drinking water loan program. So first, this general obligation pledge or alternative revenue pledge. We know that those are DNR terms that you may be familiar with, and those are ways of pledging revenue for future safe drinking water loan payments. Those are not regulated customer revenue under PSC, so we don't get involved at all with any approvals for that money. That is circulating outside of the work that we do. However, a water revenue pledge is something different. A water revenue pledge, as we understand it, is when a utility wants to pledge that future revenue toward the payment of safe drinking water loan program obligations. And so for that, we don't know why that's happening. So that is customer money that is regulated here at the PSC. However, as we've talked about, the Madison case confirmed that customer rates cannot be used to pay for a private side replacement. So regulated customer revenue, traditionally not allowed to pay for safe drinking water loan program expenses. So a water revenue pledge is not appropriate. So that's just to look at one way we intersect, and that revenue can't be pledged. Now, as Andy's talked about, there's cash on hand. That might be something different, but that's not revenue that's available. Okay, next. All right. What if the safe drinking water pays only part of the cost? So Andy kicked it off with this. We know that As that federal money dwindles a little bit, there's less grant money, and a lot of communities are looking to combinations of grants and loans to pay for things, which means that they might also be looking for the first time at creating a financial assistance program. And so it's possible that that customer side cost might be distributed among multiple funding sources. But from our perspective, again, we look at that regulated customer revenue. So as you're thinking about what an individual customer is going to have as an opportunity for funding, it might be a portion of a safe drinking water loan. It might be PF, Principal Forgiveness Grants, and it could be that the utility wants to create a financial assistance program to make up that difference. That is all allowable, as Andy said. There's nothing about mixing those revenues that disqualifies somebody from eligibility from a PSC approved financial assistance program, but we will be looking at how you segregate those costs and what costs are actually falling to the regulated customer revenue. So consider thinking about the way your buckets of money are being allocated. So remember, regulated customer revenue may be used for those grants and loans coming directly from the utility to pay for private side. It may not be used otherwise to finance lead service line removal. So it may be used for administrative costs for the utility to administer its approved financial assistance program. So that is the grants and loans coming from the utility comprised of regulated customer revenue. And you can put administrative costs in there, but may not be used with all the administrative costs associated with private site removals through that financial assistance plan. As we've talked about, you may look at some of that one-time money and cash on hand for some of these costs, and we're looking at below the line accounting, but that will become an issue during the rate case to determine the revenue requirement going forward. Okay, next. All right, we're starting to get a lot of questions for this again as the Safe Drinking Water Loan Program changes and less principal forgiveness money is available. We understand that everybody wants to prioritize mitigating the cost for actual private homeowners and removing these. And so there's an increased shift of these other project costs and soft costs from the principal forgiveness and into a loan position, which raises questions about how is that loan going to be paid back. So I just want to acknowledge that we're familiar with those questions. We have not had a case addressing a number of these soft costs, but the general principle remains that regulated customer revenue cannot be used for the private side removal. So that's regardless of whether you have a financial assistance program that's been approved. The financial assistance program allows you to create grants and loans that you give to a customer, but it's not being paid for directly through utility actions. So some of those soft costs like engineering or other things like that I understand are what people are referring to when they say soft costs are not covered by that financial assistance plan. Now, if you're going to use one-time money, below the line accounting, as Kathy described, is how you should be accounting for that. Now I'll turn this over to Andy.
All right, very much related to that is the issue of administrative costs. So can utility staff administer a private site LSL removal? To the left, you see the scenario where it's grants and loans paid for by a safe drinking water loan program source or other non-utility funds. And to the right, you see grants and loans through a commission-approved financial assistance program. So on the left, I'm going to guess you're all beginning to see the pattern here. You would not be able to use regulated customer revenues to pay utility staff to administer any part of the Safe Drinking Water Loan Program funding. That being said, there's no prohibition on the use of staff. They just can't be paid for through customer rates or regulated customer revenue. So if you wanted staff to do that, they would just have to be paid through another source. and that would be from these below the line sources. A municipality could reimburse the utility for time spent on that, or you might have a different revenue stream that you would use. But how you account for that would be very important. For the administration of a FAP, obviously that would be something that would be allowed. It's an approved program through the commission, and it's expected that utility staff would need to administer that program. You would clearly have to follow all the requirements of the FAP, and then all of the expenses and costs would be accounted in those above the line accounts that Kathy talked about earlier. Okay, as we're talking more about this below the line idea, you know, there certainly have been times when municipalities perhaps would fund some of the utility staff, that kind of a thing. They can reimburse utilities for work that is done to administer, not to actually do the work, but to administer the private side lead service line removals. General obligation funds, special charges from the municipality, perhaps, those are all potential sources of this. Again, non-utility revenue may be used for those costs. And again, you would account for these below the line. For the larger utilities would be exactly what Kathy described in terms of how to account for that. For the smaller utilities, it might be a little bit different, just based on the staffing levels and things like that that they have. They might just allocate some of those costs directly to the municipality. Okay, so this is meant to show some scenarios, and I'm trying to get at one particular issue here is this question of, can you combine funding sources for the removal of lead service, private side lead service lines? So you can see that there's 5 scenarios, and you can see the $10,000 across the top. Let's just assume that the average cost of a lead service line removal for the private side is $10,000. On the left-hand side, you'll see that there's a couple of different funding sources. The utility FAP, both the grant and the loan, and then other funding sources. In this case, it's just going to be the Safe Drinking Water Principal Forgiveness grant and the Safe Drinking Water Loan Program loan. And give me 1 second here. It looks like the lines are funky.
Displaying weird.
Okay. All right. I can't see.
It's kind of hard to explain.
Can you squeeze it down a little bit, maybe?
It's missing.
It's missing the
Is it
bottom.
missing?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let me walk you through this, and I'll correct it as we go. So I think the numbers are at least all lined up. So assuming $10,000 in scenario 1, we're going to assume that scenario 1 means the customer himself, him or herself, are paying the full cost of the private side lead service line removal. And so there is no utility FAP, grant or loan. There's no other funding source. It's the customer who's paying $10,000. For scenario 2, we're going to assume that it's a classic utility financial assistance program that is approved by the commission. There's a grant of $5,000. That's the 50% max that can be applied as a grant. And then there's the $5,000 loan that covers the remaining costs. In that scenario, the cost to the landowner, the customer, would be $5,000. I'm not getting into interest here because that would just complicate the numbers. Sometimes utilities fold the interest costs into their loan as part of the commission approved FAP. Sometimes they have the customers pay for it, but I'm not going to worry about that today. So that is number 2. The total cost to the customer, again, is $5,000. For number 3, this would have been the 3rd period, I think, when Safe Drinking Water Loan Program principal forgiveness funding was the order of the day, and most utilities were taking advantage of that. In that case, there was $10,000 principal forgiveness grant coming to that landowner for the replacement of that private side lead service line. No cost to the customer, just $10,000 from principal forgiveness. Scenario number 4 is what I think is happening a lot today, which is the 75% principal forgiveness, and then the rest of it in a Safe Drinking Water Loan Program loan. So you can see $7,500 for the principal forgiveness, $2,500 for the loan, and ideally that would mean that the customer would be paying $2,500. The last scenario really combines these two programs. And I'm going to jump down. So we're talking about $10,000. I'm going to jump down and assume that we have a $5,000 principal forgiveness grant, principal forgiveness coming from Safe Drinking Water Loan Program. So that's covering half of the total cost, $10,000. The utility could come and request a utility financial assistance program, and if they receive that, they could provide 50% of the total cost and thereby cover the remaining amount. So they could do $5,000 grant to match the $5,000 principal forgiveness money for the total cost of $10,000, meaning no cost to the landowner. I know that's a little bit confusing, but the way that the statute is written is that the grant is 50% of the total customer cost. We consider that to be the cost of the replacement before any funds were applied. In this case, it's $10,000. So regardless of what other funding might be applied to this particular landowner, they can receive a grant for up to $5,000. So hopefully that provides a little bit more information and clarity on the combination of all of these different things. Okay. Okay, the next slide I wanted to end with here is to revisit this concept or the caution that we've been kind of placing throughout many of the slides here this afternoon. What are the consequences of using some of these regulated customer revenues, perhaps in an inappropriate way? Or even some of the below the line dollars in perhaps an inappropriate way. It's very important to realize that money coming from customer rates or regulated customer revenues is needed for the utility to manage themselves, replace their infrastructure, ensure that they're meeting all of their performance metrics, to make sure that they are managing themselves in a way that's going to bring success for that utility. If they use too much money on private side lead service line replacements or anything else, they risk siphoning off some of that money for other very important things. And so what we don't want to see is a utility's financial health falling behind. And when a utility would come in for a rate case, that would be an indicator for us of, well, maybe there's something going on here because it seems like there's other issues that are beginning to occur and they're using lots of money for other reasons. So that would be something we would look at. So those critical projects, delaying routine maintenance, other capital improvements that you got to do, those things are important and still have to be maintained. We can't not do those things because we're trying to replace private side lead service lines. So other indicators of financial strain on the utility and customers, all those things are things that we would be looking at to ensure that utilities are maintaining themselves well. Okay, so with that, we're gonna open it up to other questions that you may have. Is there anything else from?
Check the questions. There's several on your example. So you might want to go back to your table.
Okay. You could go back to that fun little table. Okay, first question. Could the customer pay $2,500 of the partial principal forgiveness back to the municipality and then bring the $2,500 just move to the utility through the utility FAP? I'm not sure what he means by bring it back. This might just be something we would have to talk about individually. Here's the thing. Like I said in the very beginning, it's so noteworthy that utilities are trying to be as creative as possible to prevent customers from paying for their own private side lead service line replacement. But in doing so, some of these things become so complicated that it's really hard to wrap your head around it. And that's been what we've been spending a ton of time on. So I think when you start trying to do one thing for the benefit of another thing and then another thing, it just becomes more and more complicated. And when the commission is going to look at this, they're going to look at it very straight up. Are we using regulated customer revenues? If we are, that's prohibited unless you have a utility financial assistance program that is approved by the commission. The $5,000 FAP grant still considered using customer money. Absolutely. So that's true, right? So anything under the utility FAP, whether it's the grant or the loan, that would fall under the utility FAP. That's customer money, that's regulated customer revenue. That's all stuff that you would have to have a commission approved FAP for. And option number 5, safe drinking water loan program is being accepted as 50% principal forgiveness, 50% loan. How is the loan and interest payments for the safe drinking water program reported by the water utility? You want to go ahead and tackle that one, Kathy? Just turn the camera on.
The answer is it is not reported by the water utility because it is funds provided to the municipality. And I can handle the next one too. Oh, wait a minute, the FAP, I thought if the FAP were to cover 50% of the cost, then is it fair to say that the other 50% came from a general fund source and it's not regulated by the PSC? Angela might be better at this one, but that limited statutory authority to offer a FAP says it can be up to 50% grants and the rest would be loans, and the loans cannot be forgiven by the utility or the municipality. So the rest would have to be a loan.
Yeah, we'll go through some of that, but again, our focus is on the regulated customer revenue, and so that's what we focus on. That other 50% could come from somewhere else, and that goes a little bit back to Andy's pot of gold that he was talking about. That could be, maybe you have a community organization that is putting up money, and we wouldn't regulate that. So we'll see if we go through the FAPs if some of that is answered. All right, and then one more question, Andy, I'll read this one to you.
Sure.
I came in on a private chat. Let's see. In example 5, how would example 5 work if the municipality has different census tracts eligible for different principal forgiveness amounts?
Oh, that's a great question, because one of the things that you can't do with regulated customer revenues is apply it in any discriminatory manner. And so if you think back to principal forgiveness funding a few years back when it was kind of the primary funding source people were using, the advantage of it not being considered customer rates or customer revenues was that it did not have to worry about the 50% limit. And it also didn't need to worry about any discrimination that was part of it in their efforts to do a good thing, which is, provide money to those economically disadvantaged census tracts. So from our perspective, you would not be able to limit funding from the utility FAP program in any way similar to that. It has to be, the funding has to be treated the same for all customers within the customer class and cannot induce any discrimination.
All right. Okay, we've got a few more coming in. Customer pays 100% of the private lead water service replacement using the safe drinking water loan. No discrimination, no PSC involvement. Yeah, I mean, if that money is coming outside of regulated customer revenue, we have no involvement. We absolutely agree with that, Tim. That's what we're trying to get across. We only care when you're using utility resources or utility funds, and then it breaks out into the regulated customer revenue and then that other cash on hand.
And I see this last question I can handle. Why only 12 municipalities have the funding program? I'm assuming you mean the commission approved FAP. I think the reason for that is at the exact same time that the legislature provided this change, the DOA and DNR had access to all of the Safe Drinking Water Loan Program funding from Bill. And so I think all of a sudden you saw lots of funding coming into the utilities that were considering using these FAPs. And as a result, everybody pumped the brakes on the utility rates portion of this and tried to use the principal forgiveness funds as much as they can. Now, where we're seeing a limit to those principal forgiveness funds and more ability to have the Safe Drinking Water Loan Program loans, we're beginning to see an uptick in interest in these FAPs once again. So I think that's the reason. I think the only downside that I can think of off the top of my head would just be many utilities want to try and not have costs that the homeowner themselves have to cover. And so they're trying to avoid the loan portion of the standard 50% grant, 50% loan. And I understand that. But I think if, let's just say tomorrow, all of the federal funding dries up and there's no more principal forgiveness or loans at all, I think a lot of utilities would probably have to resort back to our utility FAPs because it would really be the only funding stream left to meet that deadline of getting a let out in 10 years.
And then, Andy, what is a reasonable time frame for submitting a PSC LSL application and receiving an approved FAP?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I would say if you're familiar with the construction process that we have here, that's the exact same process that the LS dockets have to go through. And if you're not familiar with it, it just means that there are specific statutory timing requirements that these LS dockets have to follow. So that does typically shorten the time and make sure that we're getting these things done in a proper amount of time. That being said, typically it takes about 90 to 120 days, I would say. But the number one thing that you can do to help us make that application process go quickly is to make sure that your application clearly defines what you're asking for regarding the use of regulated customer revenues. The biggest challenge we have is separating out safe drinking water funding from customer rates. And that's where we spend a ton of time. And if utilities are confused about it, it makes the process really challenging. So if you have questions about that, let us know. We'll be happy to walk through that. We are expecting some changes to our application in the future to really hone in on that, especially given all the stuff that we've presented today. So there'll be more to come on that.
And I think this is a good time, given some of the questions that come in, to say that the LS docket only approves the creation of that financial assistance program. But if it has an impact on rates, that will need to go through a rate case to actually get a new tariff to allow you to collect to finance that utility financial assistance program. So the question about if it impacts all customer classes or just the residential class, that's going to be part of the conventional rate case examination. All right, I think we need to get going. It is time. We did not get to the creation of those financial assistance programs. You will be getting a survey after this, which will be asking you if you'd be interested in a follow-up on the creation of these. So please fill out that survey. Let us know what the interest is on creating these financial assistance programs. We're going to skip all the way to the end, I think, because of time. And we'll go to our next steps here at the PSC. And should we do wrap up? Those have some few.
No, I think you're right. I think we should go all the way to the next step, 3 or 4 slides.
All right.
Your video's not on, Angela.
Yep. I don't particularly love being on video, so that was a Freudian slip. So our next steps here, we realize there's a lot of interest in this, and we are going to be uploading to our website a recording of this video, also the handouts. We're going to start trying to track and develop FAQs and put that on the website, and then we are also going to examine the LS application to see if there are any potential updates. So if you have ideas on that, please send them to me. As I said, we'll do additional webinars on this topic. So please fill out the survey and let us know what you're interested in. I am the designated contact for all things related to lead service lines. So please feel free to reach out to me. On the next slide, we are using our newsletter. So if you go on our homepage, the service type, water regulation, and then you go down to the bottom of our main page for water regulation, you can subscribe to our newsletters. I encourage you to do that. We hope to include updates there. For those questions we didn't get to today, we'll add them to the FAQs, what we'll be updating on the website. All you have to do on the homepage for the PSC is search LSL, and LSL will take you to the page that we will be updating. Like I said at the outset, we are in a freeze right now and unable to update our website, so please check back for that. And then last page. And that is how you reach me. So I'm the designated contact for all things LSL. That is my email address and my phone number. So please reach out. We are interested in providing this information to you, and we'd love to talk more, because the more we understand what you need, the better we can tailor this information. We know it's evolving, and we want to help get the lead out. So please reach out with questions and give us some feedback on this webinar. With that, I think we're done.
Thank you all very much. Thank you for working with us, and especially for all of your efforts in this complicated mission of getting the lead out. So thanks all. Have a great rest of your day.